What if the reason some Christian arguments still scare you is not because they're true, but because they were installed before you were old enough to question them? Modern apologetics does not only argue with your adult mind, it often reaches back into childhood conditioning: fear of hell, fear of disappointing authority, fear of losing purpose, fear of abandonment, fear of being cut off from your people. That's why some arguments can be logically weak and emotionally devastating at the same time. They're not just asking, "What do you believe?" They're threatening the child inside you who was taught that doubt could cost you everything. So today we're breaking down 5 apologetic fallacies that survive by hijacking childhood emotional triggers. We're not just asking whether these arguments are logical, we're asking why bad arguments can still feel powerful. By identifying these 5 manipulative patterns, we can break the cycle of indoctrination and confront reality without lingering shadows of guilt. Let's start with the appeal to fear. You've probably heard it before. What if you're wrong? Do you really want to risk hell? Eternity is too serious to gamble with. Now, on the surface, this sounds like concern, but logically, it's not evidence, it's threat inflation. The argument doesn't prove Christianity is true, it simply raises the emotional cost of questioning it. That's the power of hell as an apologetic tool. Hell turns doubt into danger, it turns curiosity into rebellion, intellectual honesty into a spiritual emergency. And sociologically, hell does more than describe an afterlife. It helps organize behavior in this life. When a community teaches children that disbelief could lead to eternal torment, it's not merely giving them a theological idea, it's placing a surveillance system inside their imagination. Long before that child has the tools to evaluate doctrine, they're taught that certain questions are dangerous, certain thoughts are sinful, and certain doubts could separate them from God, family, and safety forever. That fear doesn't disappear just because the person grows up. It can remain embedded in the nervous system, in the family structure, in the church culture, and in the social penalties attached to unbelief. This is why the threat of hell is rarely just about hell. It's about belonging. It's about obedience. It's about the fear of becoming the kind of person your community warned you against. So when the apologist asked, "What if you're wrong?" they're not simply presenting a rational challenge, they're activating an entire social world. They're pulling on childhood fears of punishment, darkness, abandonment, demons, and being unsafe without divine protection. They're invoking the parent, the pastor, the altar call, the trembling child praying not to be left behind. Hell doesn't make the argument more logical, it makes the consequences more terrifying. That's the manipulation. The fear is designed to make the cost of questioning feel greater than the cost of believing. It pressures you to treat belief like insurance, even when the claim itself has not met the burden of proof. But fear cannot carry an argument. A threat is not evidence, and a terrifying consequence doesn't make a proposition true. If the only thing keeping a belief alive is the terror of being punished for leaving it, then what you're dealing with is not confidence in truth, it's captivity through fear. The second fallacy is the appeal to authority and the appeal to tradition. You've probably heard this version as well. Are you saying your parents were wrong? Are you smarter than generations of believers? The church has taught this for thousands of years. Great theologians have already answered this. Now, at first, these arguments may sound humble. They seem to be saying, don't be arrogant, don't assume you know more than everyone who came before you. But beneath that surface is a powerful social pressure. The argument is not simply asking whether the claim is true, it's asking whether you're willing to emotionally betray the people who gave the claim to you. That's why this fallacy is so effective. It doesn't merely appeal to evidence, it appeals to loyalty. It places the truth question inside a relationship test. If you question the doctrine, you're not just questioning an idea, you're questioning your mother's prayers, your father's sacrifices, your grandmother's Bible, your pastor's sermons, your childhood church, your very cultural inheritance. That's not a small thing. Sociologically, tradition functions as more than a collection of old beliefs. Traditions become a carrier of belonging. It tells people who they are, where they come from, who their people are, what stories matter, what behaviors are honorable, and what questions are dangerous. So when an apologist says the church has believed this for thousands of years, they're not only making a historical claim, they're also invoking the weight of a whole social order. They're surrounding the doctrine with ancestors, institutions, rituals, songs, family memories, funerals, testimonies, and sacred language. The belief is no longer presented as one claim among many, it's presented as the thread holding your world together. That's why disagreement feels so expensive. A claim doesn't become true because it's repeated across generations. It doesn't become true because sincere people believed it. It doesn't become true because brilliant theologians defended it. It doesn't become true because your family built meaning around it. But apologetics often borrows the voice of the parent, the pastor, and the elder so that disagreement feels like disobedience. This is where childhood disobedience becomes an adult apologetic weapon. Many people were not raised to experience questioning as a normal part of learning. They were trained to experience questioning as disrespect. So when they become adults, the argument doesn't land on a neutral mind. It lands on a conditioned nervous system. The adult hears, what evidence supports this claim? But the child inside them hears, who do you think you are? That's the emotional trap. The appeal to authority doesn't merely just say, trust the experts. It says, trust people who formed you or risk becoming a traitor to your own story. But truth is not inherited by proximity. You can honor the humanity of the people who raised you without surrendering your mind to the claims they handed you. Your parents can be sincere and wrong. Pastors can be influential and wrong. Traditions can be old, crusty, and ancient and still wrong. And recognizing that is not betrayal, it's adulthood. Let's move on to our third fallacy, the false dichotomy. This is where apologetics presents reality as if there are only two options. Without God, life has no meaning, or without God, morality is just opinion. This is supposed to sound philosophical. It sounds like a serious argument about purpose, morality, consciousness, and even human value. But underneath the language is a false binary. Either your life was assigned meaning by God, or it has no meaning at all. Either morality came from God, or morality is fake. Either the universe has a cosmic parent in charge, or you're abandoned in a cold, empty void. That's not an argument. The apologist is not proving that God exists. They're threatening you with emotional homelessness. And that threat often works because religion doesn't merely give people beliefs, it gives people a world to live inside. It gives them a story about where they came from, why they matter, what suffering means, what love means, what morality means, and what the future is supposed to become. It gives them songs, rituals, holidays, heroes, villains, enemies, promises, and a shared language for interpreting life. So when someone begins to question God, they're not only questioning a doctrine, they may feel like they're watching the walls of their world come down. That's the sociological force behind this fallacy. The question, what is meaning without God, is rarely a neutral philosophical question. For many people, it lands as a threat against identity, belonging, moral order, family stability, and emotional safety. It targets the childhood need for structure. Children need the world to feel held together. They need the stories, the routines, the trusted voices telling them what's safe, what's dangerous, and where they belong. Religion often steps into that developmental space and says, God is the reason all of this holds together. So later in life, when the God idea begins to crack, it can feel like everything is cracking. The apologist knows this feeling, whether consciously or not. So they don't simply define God, they frame unbelief as collapse. No God means no purpose. No God means no reason to live. But that's the trick. They're not showing you that meaning depends on God. They're showing you that your old meaning system was built to make life outside of it feel unlivable. And that's a very different thing. The fact that the universe feels colder without your older story does not mean the old story is true. The fact that freedom feels disorienting at first doesn't mean captivity was safety. The fact that you have to build meaning instead of inherit it doesn't mean meaning is imaginary. Human beings create meaning through relationship, memory, love, grief, repair, curiosity, beauty, justice, and care. Meaning doesn't become fake because it's human made. In fact, human made meaning may be the only kind of meaning we've ever actually experienced. When you love your child, comfort a friend, keep a promise, build a community, tell the truth, or choose not to harm someone, that meaning is not erased because it was not assigned from the sky. It's still real. It's real because it lived. So the false dichotomy collapses. The choice is not God or meaninglessness. The real choice is inherited meaning or examined meaning. Meaning controlled by religious authority or meaning shaped through human responsibility. Apologetics want you to believe that leaving God means stepping into nothing, but many people are not leaving meaning behind. They're leaving the system that held meaning hostage. The fourth fallacy is the burden of proof shift. Now, this is when the person making the religious claim quietly moves the responsibility onto the person questioning it. You've heard this before. Can you prove God doesn't exist? Can you explain where everything came from? Can you account for morality, consciousness, and existence? Now, on the surface, these sound like serious questions, and some of them are serious questions. But again, they're not evidence for Christianity or explanations of its claims. They're attempts to make your uncertainty responsible for their certainty. The apologist makes a claim about God, scripture, miracles, resurrection, heaven, hell, sin, salvation, and eternity. But when asked to justify that claim, they turn around and demand that you explain reality without it. Now, suddenly, you're not just evaluating their belief, you're expected to solve cosmology. You're expected to explain consciousness, to ground morality. You're expected to disprove every miracle claim. You're expected to account for the origin of existence itself. But you don't have to solve the universe to reject an unsupported claim about the universe. That's the part they don't want you to see. The person making the claim carries the burden. If someone says a God exists, they carry the burden of showing that. If someone says Jesus rose from the dead, they carry the burden of demonstrating that. Your inability to answer every mystery in existence doesn't make their answer true. Sociologically, this tactic works because many people were not handed Christianity as a claim to evaluate. They were handed Christianity as the structure of reality itself. It wasn't presented as one possible explanation among many, it was presented as the world. God was the reason you woke up. God was the reason you had food on the table, the reason your family survived, the reason suffering had purpose, and the reason death was not the end. So when you begin questioning God, it doesn't feel like you're questioning one claim. It feels like you're being asked to rebuild the entire universe from scratch. That's the emotional pressure behind the burden of proof shift. They gave you the claim as a child, then made you feel responsible for disproving it as an adult. They built the belief into your family, your language, your rituals, your holidays, your identity, and your sense of reality. Then, when you start questioning it, they ask why you can't produce a complete replacement system on demand. That's inherited ideology protecting itself. This is why many former believers feel like they need a PhD in biology, physics, philosophy, biblical studies, archaeology, psychology, and ancient history before they are allowed to say, I don't believe this anymore. But belief doesn't require omniscience. You're allowed to withhold belief from a claim that has not met its burden of proof. You're allowed to say, I don't know, without letting someone else place their God inside the gap. You're allowed to admit mystery without surrendering your mind to mythology. You're allowed to reject a bad answer before you have a perfect answer. That's just intellectual honesty. The burden of proof shift trains people to feel guilty for not being able to replace the entire social and cosmic architecture that religion gave them. But the question is not whether you can instantly build a new worldview in one conversation. The question is whether the claim being presented has sufficient evidence. And if it doesn't, you're not obligated to carry it. The adult question is simple. What evidence supports this claim? Not can I provide a complete secular replacement for every emotional function religion once served. Just this. What reason do I have to believe this is true? That question is enough because the burden belongs to the claim, not to the child who inherited it. Now, the last fallacy is the sunk cost fallacy. This is the argument that says you might be on the edge of your breakthrough. Think of everything God has brought you through. What about your family, your church, your calling, your marriage? This one is powerful because it doesn't only attack what you believe, it attacks what you've already paid. The sunk cost fallacy takes the years you spent believing, serving, praying, sacrificing, giving, defending, hoping, and obeying, and tries to turn all of that investment into evidence. But the fact that you gave your life to something does not make that thing true. The fact that you suffered for something doesn't make it sacred. The fact that you built an identity around something doesn't mean that that identity was built on reality. Sociologically, this is where religion becomes more than a belief system. It becomes a life system. It organizes your relationships. It gives you a moral vocabulary. It tells you who your people are. It gives you roles to perform, songs to sing, rituals to repeat, leaders to trust, and a future to anticipate. So walking away doesn't feel like just changing your mind. It can feel like losing a country. It can feel like becoming a refugee from your own former life. That's why the sunk cost fallacy is so emotionally devastating. It forces you to calculate not only what you believe, but what you might lose if you stop believing. Family, marriage stability, friendships, community belonging. a sense of history, a sense of who you were supposed to become. And because the cost is so high, the mind starts looking for reasons to stay. That's how sunk cost turns your own history into a prison guard. Every sermon you preached becomes a chain. Every altar call you answered becomes a chain. Every tithe you paid becomes a chain. Every testimony you gave becomes a chain. And apologetics knows how to pull on those chains. It says, don't throw it all away. But the phrase hides the real question. Are you throwing your life away? Or are you refusing to keep paying for something that hasn't proven itself true? You don't have to protect a false belief just because a former version of you needed it to survive. You don't have to keep defending an idea because your family built rituals around it. You don't have to preserve a worldview because your community can't imagine you without it. You don't have to keep paying into a system because you've already paid so much. That's the entire point of recognizing sunk cost. The past explains why something mattered to you. It doesn't obligate you to keep pretending it's true. Leaving doesn't erase the years you spent inside the faith. It doesn't erase the relationships, the lessons, the sincerity, or the sacrifices. Those things happened. They shaped you. Some of them may have even helped you survive. But survival tools can become cages. The question is not how much have I already invested? The question is, would I choose this again if I weren't afraid of losing what I already gave? That's where freedom begins, because intellectual autonomy requires the courage to stop treating your past investments as a commandment. You're allowed to grow beyond the systems that once gave you language. You're allowed to honor your history without being held hostage by it. Your past can be a valid part of your story without being the rightful owner of your mind. So, when we put all five of these fallacies together, a pattern starts to emerge. These arguments survive because they do more than make claims. They manage emotions. They protect inherited systems. They turn doubt into danger, loyalty into evidence, uncertainty into guilt, and past investment into obligation. That's why this matters. Because many people are not trapped in religion because the arguments are strong. They're trapped because the arguments are attached to fear, family, belonging, memory, and even childhood survival. They're trapped because they were taught what to fear before they were taught how to think. So when modern apologetics show up and says, "What if you're wrong?" it's rarely starting a neutral conversation. It's reaching into a whole history. That's why bad arguments can still feel powerful because they're familiar, and familiarity can feel like safety even when it's control. But intellectual autonomy begins when you learn to separate the claim from the trigger. You stop debating as a frightened child trying not to get in trouble. You start evaluating as an adult with the right to ask for evidence. And that right matters because this is not just about winning arguments with apologists. This is about reclaiming your relationship with reality. That's the work, not just deconstructing doctrine, deconstructing the emotional machinery that made the doctrine feel untouchable. Because once you can name the trigger, you can break the spell. And once you break the spell, you can finally meet reality without the shadows of your childhood standing between you and the truth. Intellectual autonomy begins when fear is no longer allowed to impersonate truth. This is what it feels like to wake up from a system that trained your fear before it ever earned your trust. Well, congratulations. You made it to the end of yet another video, and I cannot tell you enough how grateful I am for your attention, your support, and the time you continue to share with this work. Because of you, our patrons, and our awesome members of Bridge City, we're slowly shifting into a new phase of operations that allows us to expand beyond weekly content and begin building something much more structured. For the past 2 years, I've been developing a framework to help transform humanism from a personal worldview into a recognized field of service. Not just something people value privately, something people can practice publicly. Through training, ethical standards, community based support, and people centered leadership development, the goal is to prepare humanist leaders to serve individuals, families, teams, and communities with clarity, compassion, structure, and most importantly, accountability. Because if we're serious about moving beyond fear, shame, superstition, and authoritarian models of leadership, then we have to build more than critique. We have to build alternatives. We have to build the professional ecosystem for people centered practice. So keep your eyes peeled because that work is in full motion. We've also started experimenting with micro courses, including one called The Paradox of Mystery. It's a companion course connected to my video on the problem with God is beyond understanding. The course includes the original video, a study guide, a podcast, a quiz, and a web app designed to help you explore the concepts more deeply. It even includes a transcript. So if this kind of work matters to you and you want to see where we're headed, check out the first link in the description and get your seat in the course today. Experience it for yourself, give us your feedback, and help us keep shaping what this can become. Well, that's all I have for now. As always, thank you for sharing your time with me. And until next time, keep rising.